I must admit up front, it's a risky thing to preach about joy during a time when we have just learned how to lament. While we surely need some joy right now, it is risky to speak of joy when we have just learned to speak their names and to say and to shout and to cry, Black Lives Matter. Part of me just doesn't know how to rejoice during a week when anti-Black white supremacy rears its ugly head once again and kills another one of us. Casey Goodson Jr., a 23-year-old Black man just trying to enter his home. He had no record. He was the subject of no investigation. But still, he was executed in Columbus, Ohio, by sheriffs looking for someone who did something that had absolutely nothing to do with Casey. A young man who had just gone out to buy Subway sandwiches for his 5-year-old brother and his 72-year-old grandmother. Yeah, beloved, it's a risky thing to preach about joy when the nation state is determined to execute as many Black people as they can before January 20th. And while I'm delighted that the Supreme Court stopped the attempts of Texas and Trump to literally steal the election, the Supreme Court did not stop this week the state-sanctioned murder. 2 Black men in 2 days. Brandon Bernard and Alfred Bourgeois. They did wrong, yes, and they deserve punishment to be sure. But when 5 Black men are scheduled to be executed since Election Day as part of the Unjustice Department's resumption of federal capital punishment, we must stop and wonder how we've allowed this to happen. Let's be clear. There were no federal executions in the 2010s, just 3 between 2001 and 2003, and literally none between 1964 and 1999. And now in 3 months, 5 Black people are to be executed. Part of me just doesn't know what to say today, on this day marked for joy, when once again it has become state sport to pass out lethal injections like the president is passing out pardons for his cronies and those who commit white-collar crimes. I don't want to be too morbid this morning on this day marked for joy, but the public spectacle of execution is not a far cry from the rejoicing of white supremacists, many of whom were Christians who left church and then went to spectate and participate in the public hanging of Negroes for sport. They took pleasure and delight in the suffering of others, and for these sadists, there was joy as they laughed at lynchings of Black bodies hanging from poplar trees in the 20th century. Now, as we enter the 3rd decade of the 21st century, the same mob rule execution by the state happens, just differently. In some way, I don't want to say too much about joy today when we have just learned how to lament and to say the names George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and Rashard Brooks and Daniel Prude and Tatiana Jefferson and Aurora Rosser and so many others. Beloved, I wondered if in worship today we should just skip joy this Advent year because so much about this year has in fact already skipped over joy. What do we do with the assigned lectionary readings for today? How do we sing Mary's song that says, "My soul magnifies the Lord"? How do we proclaim the words of First Thessalonians to rejoice always? Maybe, I wondered, beloved, we ought to substitute joy for something more practical, for more fitting for 2020, this Job kind of year. Because, right, 2020 has already given us so much that we want to give back, and we wish that 2020 came with a gift receipt. I admit to you, beloved, that I kind of wanted to run away from this theme and from the lectionary readings for today. Surely the readings were assigned years ago before the other pandemic. COVID-19 was a thing that has shattered all the expectations that we had for this year when we gathered this time last year and began to set New Year's resolutions. Right, because I want to run away from it, because talking about joy, you see, can be a slippery slope to complacency and a sense of moderation that has already crept back in with Biden's election. When we're so ready to get back to normal, we must remember that, right, Black Lives Matter began in July 2013 during the first Black presidency. So while these things have been exceedingly bad the last 4 years, we cannot afford to slip back into a past, because of the precariousness of our present has, yes, revealed some of the stark and systemic injustices that have plagued our society long before the plague of COVID-19 reared its ugly head. So yes, preaching about joy when the tendency, the all too tempting tendency, is to slip back into business as usual. It's a risky thing to preach about joy, which somehow might give permission for us just to go back. And then it dawned on me, like an Advent awakening, that yeah, it's a risky thing to preach about joy today, but it is even a more risky thing. It's a riskier thing not to. It's a risky thing not to preach about joy. And honestly, I don't know everything that I'm going to say, but sometimes we got to talk through it in order to get to it. So we might consider today to be a little bit of a group talk therapy session as we work this thing out together, and as we draw from the ancestral wisdom that we already know and that reveals itself again during Advent, as we lean into the Afro futures of what's to come. We need to talk about it. We need to risk talking about it in anticipation. Even when we do not know what is coming, we risk talking about it. We risk claiming our joy and reclaiming our joy still when we don't know how it's coming. We know that it's coming. And it's a risky thing, a reckless thing, actually a dangerous thing not to preach joy and to sing joy and to shout joy, because you get this, power and principalities are still going to keep trying to harm us and hurt us. So in preaching about joy, it helps to heal us in a world that is dead set on harming and hurting us. So we risk preaching about joy, leaning even into it when we don't know how to feel it. Even when we don't feel that joy ourselves this day, we lean into it. Right? Because joy, it's a counter agent that claims our divine agency in the face of white power and rich power and male power that says we should not call Dr. Jill Biden doctor because her doctorate is in education and not in medicine. Although we know that early childhood education is, in fact, the best way to end intergenerational poverty and combat racial disparities that lead to class inequities. Right? Joy is a counter agent that claims our divine agency in the face of the injustices that will never willingly and voluntarily stop trying to steal your joy. And justice will never voluntarily stop trying to steal your joy. So that's why we keep showing up. That's why we keep singing it. And that's why we sing the spirituals and the freedom song that says, "This joy that I have, the world didn't give it, and the world can't take it away." And catch this, beloved, even when the world tries to steal your joy, tries to take your joy, you take it back and you reclaim your joy like you reclaim your time. Yes, this year has already taken so much. It has taken our jobs and our lives and our livelihoods, and even it may have taken some of our joy. And I am determined to take my joy back. And I'm refusing to give anything else to this crappy year. So I'm gonna take back my joy and shout of that unspeakable joy that still dwells within my heart, that sometimes I don't feel in my bones, but I know that is there. I'm gonna take back that joy that the world didn't give and the world can't take away, though it's tried. Look, let me take it a little bit deeper. I know sometimes in the Black church, we like to say, right, don't let the devil steal your joy, right? That works sometimes. But catch this, there's something about theft, right? Sometimes, despite the high tech alarm systems that we've got with all of our security cameras and the yard signs and the Ring doorbells and all the fancy apps and the guard dogs, sometimes your stuff still, despite all the protections that we have, sometimes our stuff still gets stolen. And sometimes, despite our best efforts, theft still happens. So when somebody steals something from you, when they try to steal your joy, sometimes you just got to steal it back. So you have my pastoral permission, beloved, to steal your joy back because it is your divine birthright. And joy is your ancestral heritage. So I implore you, by all means, find your joy and get your joy and take back your joy and even steal your joy back if it's been stolen from you. Because here's the good news. Advent tells us that even when the world tries to rob us of our joy, there is one who did not consider it robbery to break into the world that tries to break our bodies. There is one who breaks into the world and enters into human form, and God humbled God's self to suffer with us. That's joy. So today, on this third week of Advent, I'm preaching about joy and the ancestral wisdom of our song. This joy that I have, that's in our bones and in our DNA, that is our birthright. And singing that song, it reminds us to ground our joy, to root our joy, and to build our joy not in the world, but in the world maker, the God who so loved the world that God would transform the world through the incarnation of the one we proclaim as the Christ. You see, that's why during Advent on this third week, there is a turning this week as we light the shepherd's candle, the third pink candle marked for joy. Week 3, you see, is a liturgical shift from the solemnity of the season to a season of rejoicing. This rejoicing is grounded, to be sure. It is grounded in the reality and the pain that we have endured, and then having grounded it in that reality, it transforms it. Like that Advent song we sang and we sing every week, O come, Emmanuel. And in the melody, we feel and we hear the bit of sadness and the tinge of sorrow in the verses that this great hymn bears. Because it is true, as it's been said, that the site between being and love is called melancholy. That in between space where we are and the love that we hope to be, that site is called melancholy. So, O come, Emmanuel, it bears a bit of it as we bear the melancholy of these days. But then something happens when we sing that song and we make our way through the verses and we get to the refrain. Sometimes you've got to sing it again, because in the refrain there is a turning. And when you sing, O come, Emmanuel, sometimes you just got to pause and inhale before you get to the refrain so that you can belt out, rejoice, rejoice. Emmanuel has come and is coming again and again. So, beloved, when joy does not seem to come easily, keep coming for your joy until joy comes for you. You see, beloved, that's what we talk about during this season, the season that starts a Christian New Year. That's what we're talking about during this series, Advent in an Anxious Age. Right? We're not talking about a flimsy hope. We're not talking about fake peace. There is no cheap grace. And I submit to you today that there is no jankety joy, nothing that is poorly put together. No, beloved, the joy that I'm talking about today is real and rooted and grounded. You see, that's why it's important, always important for us to read in context. Because here's the joy that the prophet Isaiah preaches about. For I, Yahweh God, love justice and hate robbery and sin, so I will faithfully compensate you, declares the Lord, and I will make an everlasting covenant with you. The prophet Isaiah says that you, beloved, will restore the ancient ruins, and you will rebuild sites long devastated, and you will repair the ruined cities neglected for generations. Why? Because the Spirit of the exalted God is upon you, And Yahweh, God has anointed you, each and every one of you, beloved, and God has sent you to preach good news to those who are poor, to heal broken hearts, to proclaim release to the captive and liberation to those who are in prison, to announce a year of favor from God and a day of vindication, to comfort all who mourn, to provide those for those who grieve in Zion, to give them a wreath of flowers instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of tears, a cloak of praise instead of despair. And then you, beloved, you who are comforted and you who are comforting, you will be known as trees of integrity, planted by God to display God's glory. Yeah, I need you to hear this in Isaiah's message for us today. Joy and justice and jubilee go hand in hand in hand. Liberation and flourishing and freedom from oppression are inextricably linked and connected to each other. And that's something worth rejoicing for. So the prophet says, I will joyfully exult in God, who is the joy of my soul. I love that verse, verse 10 of chapter 61. I will joyfully exult in the God of justice, who is the joy of my soul. So then that command to rejoice always is more of a call, an invitation to rejoice in the Lord. And the joy of the Lord is our strength. Here's a modern interpretation. It's been said happiness is circumstantially driven, while joy is spiritually derived. Happiness is given to us by circumstances, the ways of the world which come and go and move, but joy, it runs deeper. It's in our bones, in our spirit. Joy is not mere sentimentality. It is a resilient resistance born of the ancestors who still had joy despite all the things they had been through. They might have had to steal away sometime to Jesus. They did that too. And they sang that spiritual, steal away to Jesus, because there's still a way in Jesus. And as we steal our joy, we still have joy. Yet joy will look differently for everyone and feel differently for us all this year. So as I close, I ask and invite you, what is the deepest source of the deepest joy that you know? The deepest joy that you have ever known? That ancestral joy, that Afro-futuristic joy that we encounter in our mind's eye, which is to say, it's coming. And we're building a city, not made with hands, but a city we feel in our hearts. And we know the way to that place. We know how to get there. We know how to find it. Even though sometimes joy is shy. And joy likes to hide sometimes, which is why we must go looking for her in the everyday. So bake it, right? There's joy somewhere in the roux of the mac and cheese. Just after the butter melts and melds perfectly with the flour, and it's a golden brown. There's joy right there after you've added the cream and the milk, and just before you start folding in the cheddar and the cheese gets gooey. There's joy there. Walk towards it, because there's joy right along the Fenway early in the morning, Gary. Just before the first ray of sunlight breaks through the ferns, when you can barely see the ground beneath you, though you can feel the ground below you. Walk on it. As you walk the Fenway, as the light just begins to shine. Sometimes as you walk in the dark, you've got to be careful to dodge the droppings from the geese who aren't scared of your presence because it's their home anyway. Or maybe you don't dodge the droppings at all, because sometimes in life you just have to walk through the shit and the really crappy circumstances of life in order to get to where you're going on the road less traveled. Experiment with it, that joy, like I'm going to do tonight, because I'm going to make a sweet potato pie. I've got the cinnamon and the cloves and the nutmeg, and of course I have the yams. And I'm not sure if it'll taste like the ones the church mothers used to bake back home. And I'm not sure if mine will be not edible at all. Beloved, I'm baking my first sweet potato pie tonight. And there's joy in trying. So create your joy and compose it and write it. And of course, sing it. Because though during those dark nights of weeping, when it's hard to see the light, we keep seeing, we keep singing, because in our hearts, we still know that joy will return. Weeping endures for the night. Joy comes in the morning. I'm not always sure what that joy will look like, but I do know that I want to see it in the morning. So this is my ode to joy. Thanks be to God. Amen.